Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the channel. I'm Brian Lusk. Thank you for joining me today. We have got a lot of stuff to go through, though not as much as there's been for the last couple of days. This was, I just started a new job, and it was a very busy day today. So it was a little bit shorter than normal, I think, on my research today, but don't worry, we're going to get the big things here and let you know what's going on in the war. I do think that I'll be able to maintain at least a similar schedule going forward, but we'll see how that turns out. As you come in, absolutely chime in. Let me know you're here. I would be delighted to see if you guys let me know you're here, and overall ask your questions and interact with everything we talk about. So let's go ahead and get started on kind of the big news over this last weekend, and that is the death of Iranian president and Ibrahim Raisi and the foreign minister Hossein Amir Abdullahian in a helicopter crash in Iran. This was a big one here. There was I can just give you the summary of the whole thing. The helicopter was flying in less than ideal conditions in mountainous terrain, crashed or otherwise came down, and the remains of the helicopter were found many hours later. The rescuers were having to go through some thick fog to try and find anything. They actually called, get this, at one point, they actually asked the United States if they had a drone they could use to look for their president. The U.S. said they didn't have the assets available at that point in time. But Turkey did provide a drone to assist in the search. They did finally locate the helicopter, brought rescuers to it, and there's not much left. So that's your high-level overview. Now, I'll go into kind of some of the conspiracy theories and things like that and give you my conclusions at this point in time, waiting until there's actually some additional information to come out. Iranian officials were cagey for quite some time. They said they had received a call from the helicopter itself that there were survivors, but by the time they got people actually on scene at the crash site, no survivors were reported. But eventually they did confirm the death of the president and the associated staff that were on board the helicopter. This has been really kind of a surprise at how bad they did on this one. The crash happened in remote mountains in Iran. It was in a very remote part of the country. And as you can see in this picture here, let me get this large so you can kind of see it. This is the conditions it was flying through. Heavy, thick fog. Iran finally reported. Now, understand, they reported this before they could actually examine the wreckage in any detail, stated that was due to a technical malfunction of the aircraft. Now, I'm going to take a brief pause here. I don't think I have this elsewhere. Let me just kind of double check. Okay, yep, I don't have this elsewhere. Don't have this elsewhere right now, but the Iranians have already blamed the Americans. But they were very careful about how they phrased their blame for the Americans. Specifically, they said that the sanctions that they had carried out against Iran resulted in them having to use this 45-year-old helicopter. They weren't able to get parts for it. They didn't have instrument flight rating equipment on it. They didn't have any of the latest equipment at all. And this was all because of American sanctions. And so therefore, America killed the Iranian president. Pretty typical. Now, you would think that they would use their noggins and maybe not use a 45-year-old questionable aircraft in flight conditions that you wouldn't so much as maybe walk in, much less fly an airplane or helicopter. But that's Iran for you. Hi, Al. Glad to have you on board. Always glad to see you. The bodies of those deceased have been taken to the city of Tabriz for further examination, and they are actually, as I understand it, they're going to have a funeral in just a couple of days here. I think in 2 days, as I understand it. This is kind of more video of the conditions the search and rescue team had to hike through. And again, I want to point this out. As Robbie just mentioned there, it's funny how they chose to fly in those conditions, yet blame us. Exactly. They were flying through pea soup in mountainous terrains in a helicopter that was not rated for instrument flight rating. And this is, no matter how you slice it, if they don't have proper GPS, don't have proper instrument flight capabilities, what are they doing taking the president of their country through this area? Heaven's sakes, land somewhere, take a break, take a nap, come back to it the next day. But don't fly in these conditions. It's almost like they're asking to die, especially in these mountainous terrain. It's absurd. This is a first photo of the wreckage of the site, according to journalist Jason J. Smart. The Russian press said it was totally incinerated. I won't say the rest of what he said there. It's pretty straightforward. The Kremlin, however, has gone conspiracy theory already. They say the Racy's death was not just a helicopter crash only, that there's always something more going on. They blamed the Jews, or they blame the Americans. They blame anybody but their pilot or their decision-making process here. But that's the Kremlin for you, and that's not to be surprising at all, really, honestly. Now, this one, I want to point this out. This picture comes from Crimean Wind. I did a reverse image search on this. This is actually about a 2-year-old. It came from 2022 picture. And he points out that Crimean Wind points out Iran has a future. Now, he does not claim this is associated with the wreck or the death of Racy or anything like that, but he's just showing that there is a strong desire for freedom amongst young Iranians. You have to understand, in the early 70s, Iran was basically a Western democracy almost. It was very much a liberal in the classic sense, not like modern day liberals. Country. They had women weren't required to wear head coverings. They could use swimsuits. They could walk around on their own. They could own property. They could drive cars, etc. And when the Ayatollah took over, well, now it's a strongly oppressive regime. This is purported to be the in London, across from the Iranian embassy, with Iranian immigrants. Let me mute that real quick because that's loud. Immigrants celebrating the death of Racy here. Some of them are flying like Israeli flags. Others are flying Iranian flags, but they're celebrating, not mourning the situations here. So interesting. I don't know for sure that these are Iranian or former Iranians, though he claims that they are Iranian immigrants. Some people got a little bit excited and started firing off fireworks in Tehran. Interesting, and I'll tell you why. Short as this news was coming down, I went to x.com and I found one of their spaces, and I popped in there, and there was somebody in there who claimed that he had contacts in the country that were looking at the situation in Tehran, that nobody was firing off fireworks except this one guy, and it just whatever. Very much pitching this as a very different view than the outside world is seeing. So the Iranians are definitely in face-saving mode to the maximum extent. There's more than one view of fireworks being fired off, though, so it's not just one dude and a couple of fireworks. There's several. I won't go so far as to say many, mainly because this country is one that is fully in a situation of oppression, and they have to be very careful about this type of thing. So, interesting. Something to watch for. Vladimir Putin, though, announced that he will travel to Iran with strict security measures and an escort of 4 Sukhoi 35 planes. And he will participate in the funeral ceremony of Iranian president the day after tomorrow. Gutsy. I'm going to put it that way, gutsy. He's already wanted by the international criminal courts. Most of the nations along that route are going to be, if he has to land there, he's going to get arrested. However, on the other hand, there's certain nations that would not arrest him, that if he diverts through, not such a big deal. So this will be interesting to see. With as paranoid as Vladimir Putin is, I'm genuinely surprised that he made this announcement. However, there's no guaranteeing that the actual Vladimir Putin will make that trip, as he does have multiple body doubles. Now, I did mention that there was a Turkish drone that was summoned in to survey the area to find the fallen helicopter. And after the drone had finished its mission, you can see what it doodled in the sky here: a Turkish crescent and star. I mean, he didn't have anything else to do. His mission was effectively done. So he went and doodled in the sky while he waited to be released from station. And that's the situation with Iran. Now, after all that, honest to goodness, I can only speculate about what's going to happen. And I cannot claim to know all that's going on in Iran or the things that are going on. I am fairly convinced there will be a power struggle that will happen in Iran as people try and take this position. However, the presidency is not exactly the most powerful position in the country. That's the Ayatollah. The president is weaker. That said, he was also second in line to take over the Ayatollah's place if the Ayatollah passed away. So take your pick. I suspect there will be some action by the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps to make sure that the nation stays intact at this point in time. The question is going to only be, will there be infighting for who takes his job? So we'll be watching for that. Other news, Ukraine reported that it destroyed a Russian sea minesweeper, Kovrovets, overnight. Now, I'm going to give you some heads up here now that we're talking about this. There's been a lot of confusion about the ships, and I do say ships, there's more than one, that may have been sunk in the last 2 days. This Kovrovets Russian minesweeper, Ukraine's Navy says that they absolutely destroyed it, though they always say that they're waiting for official reports on it. But they said they destroyed it. And then, of course, a separate report comes out saying that ATACMS missiles struck a pier and a ship in Sevastopol, sinking a Cyclone-class caliber cruise missile carrier. So they're reporting that we've seen reports from the Russians and from Ukrainians and from civilians and from satellite pictures. This thing is sunk. There's no question in anybody's mind. The Kovrovets, however, is a little bit more murky. We did see one of these being towed into port the other day, but it was before the supposed strike that sunk it. So there's a possibility that there was only one ship sunk, and that would be this Cyclone or Cyclone cruise missile launcher. However, there's also the possibility that there were two ships, and at this point in time, I believe it was two ships, mainly because of the quantity of reports associated. That doesn't mean that's the only possible interpretation. Obviously, this is more on that attack. The Russians are the ones that actually reported 3 hits with ATACMS missiles, though they claim that 12 were launched and 9 were intercepted, with, once again, no proof. Tindar is on the side of believing that the two ships got mixed up and that only one of them was actually sunk. But I can't prove it one way or another at this point. Just understand there is the controversy, potentially one or potentially two ships of the Black Sea Fleet put on the bottom. Now let's move into the news out of Ukraine. Amid increased Russian attacks, electricity imports from all of Ukraine's neighboring countries, except, of course, Belarus and Russia, have repeatedly become a lifeline for the country. You can see the map here. If it's in blue, these are net positive exports. The red is negative net exports, meaning that they're having to bring in more power than they're exporting. And you can see that during the early part of the war, Ukraine was a net power exporter. It fell off in this September 22 to January-ish timeframe, where they became a net importer, and then, of course, recovered for a while, exporter, importer. And you can see that it's getting worse over time here for Ukraine because the damage to their infrastructure is getting extensive. But even so, there was a brief period where they were exporting again, And now they're back into having to import power to keep them in juice right now. So that's the situation on the power. They are introducing nationwide blackouts on starting tonight. Well, actually, this would have been hours ago now. It's almost dawn there, if I've got my hours correct. So they've been pretty much in the dark overnight. Kirilo Lukrenko actually took some of these pictures here, showing Ukraine, Kiev, actually in the dark. You can see a few lights here and there. Probably people with either generators or flashlights or other, things that are keeping just a few of the lights lit rather than having the entire town being entirely without power. But most everybody has got their power pulled off. Now comes the item that the Russians are going to be pushing on for probably the next 6 months, would be my estimate. This claim that Vladimir Zelensky is illegitimate because the end of his term ended today. Now, so we're clear on this, absolutely. I've looked at the Ukrainian constitution. There is a provision for delaying elections during martial law. This is what they're using at this point in time. That's not exactly perfectly clear that the president is also included in that, but it is potentially implied. It definitely says that the elections for the Verkhovna Rada or their parliament equivalent cannot take place in a situation of martial law. And they have been in martial law pretty much since the start of the war. So Putin and his flunkies they're pushing on this now, saying, okay, his term is over. He's illegitimate. He's a dictator now. So that's what they're saying. Of course, Dmitry Medvedev just put it straight up that Zelensky is a legitimate military target. I mean, there's no other. I'm just going to point out if Zelensky's a legitimate military target, so is Vladimir Putin. Just saying. Then, according to Dmitry at War Translated, he says, it's hilarious to read today the whining of the slaves of their forever master. Oh, excuse me. President of 5 terms, which is, I believe, 3 more terms that he's supposed to have taken according to their original constitution, which he forced through in an illegitimate way of modification to so he could stay in power effectively indefinitely. So he's been president for 5 terms and 30 years. And he's the one claiming that Zelensky's the one that's illegitimate. So let's move on to the news out of Russia itself. There's a couple of items here that I think you'll find interesting. Ukrainian forces reportedly conducted successful drone strikes against Russian military infrastructure and oil refineries in occupied Crimea, Krasnodar Krai, and Leningrad Oblast on the night of May 18th through 19th. That would be, night before last. The Russian MOD claimed that Russian forces destroyed 9 ATACMS missiles over occupied Crimea. They love to claim that with no proof. Of course, the Kremlin has been claiming that Ukrainian forces had launched 12 ATACMS against Sevastopol Bay, and it's all back and forth on this. But understand, there was a series of successful strikes. But this is kind of the more interesting thing I took away from the Institute for the Study of War. Russian mill bloggers appear to be experimenting with different ways to express critical opinions of the Russian Ministry of Defense, following the recent appointment of Russian Defense Minister Andrei Belousov. This is one of them was a Russian mill blogger who posted a photo on May 18th of an undated document, allegedly from the Russian Ministry of Defense's head of the Missile and Artillery Weapons Service. That was long. Responding to an appeal about the inaccuracy of Russian artillery, except for the Russians say their artillery is not inaccurate. So they're finding ways to subtly stick it to the Ministry of Defense, calling them out on their activities. Now, there was a series of missile strikes. One of the more significant ones was this one in Luhansk, which was a strike near the base of the Russian Academy of Internal Affairs, basically cop training grounds there. But before the smoke and fire had even cleared, Russians were already putting out these pictures showing fragments of the weapons and the supposed country of origin of those weapons. Seems pretty coincidental. Awfully fast action there. But they also struck a military facility with Scalp EG missiles, And there's all kinds of reporting on this. Over in Dovzhansk, a fuel warehouse was hit, and I've got some more details on this that really puts this into perspective. This was an ATACMS strike on the Russian military bases in the city of Dovzhansk in occupied Luhansk, deep in the rear, over 150 kilometers from the front line. This city is just 10 kilometers from the Russian border. For those of us who don't speak metric, that'll be about 6 miles, in southeast Ukraine, and has been occupied since 2014. Fuel and lubricant storage destroyed. Now, fuel and lubricant are two things that are vital for Russia's military advances. If they cannot keep their trucks and jets fueled, they can't fly them. If they can't lubricate things, they break down faster. And if they can't lubricate the wrong things, they blow up better. So this is a pretty vital facility that got taken out. Hi, Paul. Glad to have you here. Always glad to see you as well. So we've got Robbie and Al and Paul. We've got quite the crew tonight. So this was quite the strike deep in the rear, not just close stuff. This is not, this is not the short range ATACMS stuff. But this is not even at the limits of the new ATACMS that have shown up. So interesting that Ukraine is making this effort here, and it's clear they're trying to put the squeeze on Russia's logistics. Now, there was an additional attack on a military airfield in Krasnodar Krai at Kushovskaya, and they do report that a Russian Su-27 was damaged. This is actually reported by Astra, which is a news organization that's relatively independent but reports in Russian. They say at least 3 drones struck the airfield, and that the fire damaged a fighter jet and caused and some infrastructure. So interesting. No, not clear that the jet was a write-off yet, but Ukraine is going serious whole hog after all of Russia's aircraft. If they can take them out when they're on the ground, it makes it a whole lot easier than dealing with them when they're dropping bombs from the air. Now, from the Right Honorable Grant Shapps, Ministry of Parliament, Putin's total mobilization of his economy is simply not sustainable, and he knows it. If all allies match the UK's pledge to maintain support to Ukraine for the next 6 years, we can exploit this weakness and make it impossible for the Russian economy to maintain its war effort. And that is in many ways true. The GDP of the nations opposed to Russia is massive. The question is, do they have the willpower to do it? Russia is currently experiencing a labor shortage that is becoming a significant problem in some sectors. According to estimates by the independent Russian media outlet Izvestia, Russia had a 4.8 million shortage of workers in 2023. As an example, the Russian transport and logistics industry was unable to fill 25% of its truck driver vacancies during 2023. The labor shortage has been caused in part by the war in Ukraine, which sucks up able-bodied men all across the nation. Plus, there were some that abandoned the country, vacated the place once the war started. And on top of that, after the ISIS-K attack in Moscow, all of a sudden, all their immigrant labor that was filling those gaps was invited to make itself scarce and return to its home country. So they have not only got a labor shortage due to various of their own actions, but they have made it even worse by getting rid of immigrant labor that they were using to fill the gap. So this is a very bad situation for Russia to be in. I'm not saying they're collapsing. I'm just saying it's a tough one for them in that regard. Luciano, glad to see you as well. Thank you very much for joining. All right, so more on the Luhansk strike. I don't think we need to go back into that. Now, this was Kushovskaya, but this is also talking about Slavyansk oil refinery being struck as well. And I think I've got this over here somewhere. Not that one. That's going to be an interesting one as well. Okay, nope, I don't have it just handy. If I come to it, I'll try and reference it back again. So the reports I'm getting is that this is once again the vital structure, the one they've been hitting on all the other refineries, that is their cracking tower. The shortage of fuel is getting so desperate that Wagner mercenaries are now being used to guard fuel moving from Belarus to Russia. This is to try and patch up the holes in its military fuel supplies. In the meantime, five freight cars in a freight train derailed in the Sverdlovsk region. They were empty cars that derailed with no casualties reported, but this whole area has been suspended from further operations in this sector. So interesting. This is, I think, the third train in the last 2 weeks to lose itself, shall we say? And you can see that even that they have had to re-get everything off the tracks. There may be further damage. There's no indications of fire on this one, so it should be a relatively short-term situation as long as they can figure out why it derailed. And if they can figure that out, they can open these up in pretty short order. Another sign that Russia's hospital situation is getting pretty desperate. In Omsk, a former maternity hospital will be turned into a hospital for the military. I didn't know that many of their soldiers were giving birth, but you can tell that they're getting desperate if they're taking those beds where you stick the legs up in the air so that you can give birth, and they're giving them to the soldiers as well. Here it is. This is what I want to talk about here. From Crimean Wind. And you also don't know why Russian air defense shoots down all Ukrainian drones over oil refineries every time in such a way that the debris falls on the gas fractionation unit, the most vulnerable part of production where hot ethane, propane, and butane are stored. Remember, every time that there's a drone strike in Russia, the Russians claim that they managed to shoot down the drone. And nearly every time, shortly afterwards, we get reports of this fracturing unit. Has a specific name, which I don't remember right now, but that unit being the one that gets hit by the debris. Very interesting aim by Russian air defense, if so. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I was once a very avid reader. I've been a little bit too busy these days to do a lot of reading, but I still read, and I still read quite a bit. But Russian propagandist Simonian continues her tale of the decaying West, saying that people don't read books in the United States and don't even have them at home. I've got my little bookshelf right here. We got hundreds of books downstairs, and I've got even more scattered around here somewhere. It's anything they can do. Of course, to be brutally honest, we in the West often say much the same thing about Russians, that is. And that is just as inaccurate in that same regard. However, we know that much of the remote parts of Russia, and even the not so remote parts of Russia, often are surprised when they see something as high-tech as a toilet. So, who's really in decay here? That's all I'm going to say. Exactly, Al. You've bought a couple of books. I know Robbie wrote a book. There are so many books here in the United States and so many people who love to read them. My own children devour books, and I don't mean chomp chomp. I mean, whoa, lots of reading there. They love to read, and they will not be putting those books down anytime soon. Now, I kind of mentioned this in a previous video. Putin has put Russia on a permanent war footing. And in fact, there's some people that say that he can't afford to not be at a war footing at this point in time. Otherwise, the whole house of cards comes crashing down. Anton Herashchenko kind of goes through this about the reshuffle of the government and the addition of Belousov as the Ministry of Defense head. His priorities were to integrate the defense and civilian economies, which actually means shifting the country's economy to the needs of the war and to make the ministry truly open to innovation, which means more than just buying the latest technology and drones. So this looks like it's taking all of Russia's output, all of Russia's capabilities, and throwing it into what's necessary for the war efforts. Is that what's going to happen? I think the corruption will make sure that there is not enough of it to go around. But the end result is still going to be that they are, instead of producing anything to make a longer-term, more prosperous Russia, they're building tanks and planes and bombs. Now, there is an economic benefit to building bombs and tanks and planes. However, if you're immediately turning around and dropping those bombs and losing those tanks and planes, the long-term economic benefit therefrom is negated, and in fact, it becomes a negative in short order. So, by going to entirely war production in this same regard, he's basically going to sacrifice the prosperity of his nation, such as it is, on the altar of constant war. From Dmitry at War Translated, for the Russian occupiers, there's been a lot of missile strikes on gatherings of Russian troops. They now recommend not congregating at all in one place closer than 300 kilometers from the front, amongst other things. Of course, 300 kilometers, that doesn't stop any of those drones that Ukraine's been using lately. And in the realm of incompetence, Shoigu's deputies in the Ministry of Defense unmasked the locations of all secret nuclear sites for convenience in their $100 billion embezzlement scheme. This is a project that's proposed to lay fiber optic cables to the nuclear sites, and this documentation clearly identifies the locations. So good job, Shoigu. We might know why you're no longer in charge of the Ministry of Defense. Now, if you hold any Gazprom stock, number one, I'm sorry. You shouldn't have done that. But this is Gazprom stock. Looks like it's going about the same place as Truth Social is going to be going in short order as well, because Gazprom is in bad shape. They've had a lot of their vital facilities taken out. They've been under severe sanctions. Gazprom, which was once the jewel of the Russian Federation, the one that was bringing in money hand over fist, is now running heavily in the red. Moving on to the international side here. U.S. Treasury Secretary Yellen in Germany. Russia has bet that its brutal aggression can outlast our collective resolve. But we have shown that when a dictator takes action that threatens our people, economies, and the rules-based order, we will not back down. We need to continue cracking down on Russian sanctions evasion, including through third parties and sensitive goods that originate in the U.S. and Europe. It's also critical that we ensure Ukraine has the support it needs to equip its military, fund critical services, and ultimately rebuild in the medium to long term. Now, Treasury Secretary Yellen is perhaps talking a little bit in advance, putting the cart before the horse in this case, but still, at least it's a positive sentiment. Russia, for its part, has been jamming GPS systems. They've been doing a lot of that around Kaliningrad. Well, now they're bringing Romania into the mix, jamming the GPS systems in Romania and the regions neighboring the Black Sea, right near the NATO base. This appears to be a part of the evidence that Russia is at war with the West. Estonian Prime Minister Kallas said that NATO countries should stop worrying about dragging the alliance into war with Russia by sending troops into Ukraine just to train Ukrainian forces. Get the full quote here. There are countries who are training soldiers on the ground already, and they did so at their own risk. If training personnel were attacked by Russian forces, it would not automatically trigger NATO's Article 5 Mutual Defense Clause. Makes sense. They're there in country. They're putting themselves in harm's way in order to carry out this training deal here. It's not exactly an attack on the host country. Sorry, not the home country of these soldiers. Still doesn't make it nice. Just put it that way. Very naughty, in fact. France has been discussing the potential of allowing Ukraine to strike inside Russia with the French-supplied Scalp EG and also the AASM-250 Hammer bombs. Now, the real key here, and I'm kind of want to give just kind of paint the picture here, is that by and large, throughout this entire operation, Russia has brought their soldiers onto Ukrainian territory before then marching into further into Ukrainian territory. So they go into the occupied sections and they march into further unoccupied sections to try and take them, do their attacks. But the Kharkiv and potential Sumy offensives have revealed a weakness in Western supply, specifically that they've lined up troops on the other side of the border. They're on Russian territory. They're not on Ukrainian territory. It's clear they're about to attack. But they can't use ATACMS missiles, and they can't use Scalp EGs, and they can't use Storm Shadows. to stop them from coming. So they have to use their domestic drone production, their domestic weapons production, in order to take out these troops that are just standing there waiting to march across the border. So that's the problem. There's soldiers are about to attack, but they can't respond in kind at the level they need to be able to. So there's been a lot of conversations about allowing this. There may be a set of specific limitations on it. I don't know. There's all kinds of conversations way above my head. Spain is busting out the Leopard 2A4 tanks and various types of ammunition, including 155 millimeter and a bunch of other stuff, and they're shipping it over to Ukraine. Now, the 2A4 tank is an excellent tank. It's well armored, and even compared to current standards, I believe they're up to the 2A7. But it's still got that 120 millimeter gun and a very impressive armor package. Ukraine likes to take their Contact 1 blocks and stick them all over everything. They'll probably do the exact same thing to these Leopard 2A4 tanks and up armor them that way. The Dutch also busted out the storage lockers and are sending another batch of YPR 765 IFVs. I am not familiar with this one. It's a relative of the M113. I don't know how it's been doing on the front lines, so I can't really speak to it. I've not really seen anything on it. Then again, usually if I was seeing it blown up, yeah, I think we'd know more about what's going on. There were other things in that Spanish package, including Patriot missiles, anti-drone, optronic surveillance and tracking systems, and remote weapons turrets. Paul says, imagine the amount of nonsense required before the French lead the charge to cut through that nonsense. We are actually at that point now. Now, Paul, I'm just going to put this straight up for you. And this is not, I'm not just being silly right now, but honest to goodness. We would not be a nation without France. In 1775, the French were sending muskets. The French were sending military advisors. The French were sending coats, jackets, and uniforms. The French were sending food and supplies. And that is the France that I have in my head. A lot of people like to mock them, say, with the whole for sale French assault rifle, never fired, dropped once, I don't ascribe to that because I recognize that they are our allies. But you are absolutely correct. The West's rules for Ukraine are absolutely insane. It's absurd. And France, I can easily see them stepping up to the plate on this one. And that's the reason why I went into that, to say that France has a lot more guts than we like to give them credit for. Doesn't matter how much you need cheese or snails or whatever else they eat over there. I don't care if they're eating baguettes all the time, but they're good people, especially when the chips are down. Okay, I already talked about that there. And Paul, that is not anything against you. You said it. I just had to jump in there for a bit and talk about it for a moment. I think I've got a little too much history wandering around in my head right now. Maybe I should dump some out every once in a while, get some fresh history in there. The U.S. will provide assistance to Ukraine until Russia's withdrawal from its territory. This is said by the U.S. ambassador at the UN Security Council when Russia was complaining once again that the West was sending lethal aid to Ukraine and thus extending the war. So the U.S. ambassador to the UN at least put him right in his place and said, we'll keep sending the weapons as long as Russia is on the territory. In fact, Victoria Nuland, who is often claimed to be the author of the color revolutions that have been happening over in the Eastern Europe, has joined the chorus calling for Biden to end Jake Sullivan's insane policy of blocking Ukraine from striking Russia's launchers, bomber aircraft, and troop concentrations that sit just across the Russian border. And Jay in Kyiv says, fire Jake Sullivan. He seems to believe he is the be-all, end-all expert on Russia, and he is the one that appears to be holding the reins back, keeping that assistance from going to Ukraine in a timely fashion. I'm not going to talk about this one too much, but basically, I'm going to give the link here for this one. European investigators have been very careful about how they're expressing their concerns about recent sabotage on strategic infrastructure that's been taking place. They say that it smells like Russia, and it's very likely that Russia's behind it. So I want to just paste that there. Absolutely read it. Anton Herashchenko, absolutely worth the follow. So if you get the chance to follow him, absolutely do it. He's very good, both an excellent writer and a very good source overall. And that's the situation on the international front. Let's go ahead and jump into the front lines. We got stuff from 2 days, so let's go ahead and pop through it real fast. Most of these changes are small, but Robotyne is a big question mark, and Verbova had a bit of a thing going on. So let's take a look. You can see here that Robotyne has gotten into a significant gray zone. And it looks like that's the situation there. We've got some additional information on it as well. So bear with me as we go through. Verbova had a bit of a change as well. There we go. You can see that's a bunch of open territory. The ability to hold this land is getting tenuous because there's not much to hide behind right now. Pereskovivka, kind of just a maneuvering around of some lines. You can see they lost some territory on the south end there. Yasno Brodivka. This is the biggest change, but all pretty much open territory. So, yeah, all of these are just kind of small, relatively speaking, advances through open territory. So just be advised, there's a bunch of little things. So that's the kind of the long story short on that. But for today, Stelmachivka, there we go. There was another small advance here. Again, open territory. That's what we're mainly seeing exchange hands right now. There's a couple of other things here, but that's kind of the overview of the map. We'll be coming back to that as we get other things going on. Now, the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed they occupied Bilohorivka in Luhansk region, but this was outright false. In fact, the Russian mechanized assaults were repelled there. They've got video evidence of that fact. Ukrainian forces inside Volchansk are using the FGM-148 Javelin ATGM to target Russian heavy equipment. No surprise, you can see that things are pretty beat up over there as well. A big mechanized attack by Russia towards Chasiv Yar was repelled by the GUR unit Kraken, or Kraken, I think would be the correct pronunciation. And Orozhina, this is an area where the Russians had been pushed back during the summer offensive last year, and pretty significantly so. A couple of villages and towns were pushed through, and then they finally stabilized things. They are trying to push back north there. Orozhina is, they attempted to attack there, but had their tanks and equipment and personnel destroyed there. Now, here's the situation in Robotyne. We kind of mentioned that there was a big gray zone there. There's now more evidence that the Russians are in the center of the town. Not the east side just yet. So that's kind of how Robotyne is going at the moment. And this is Verbova, again, that open area they took. In the Kharkiv region, besides fighting in Volchansk, not much has changed at the moment. Ukrainians are watching the Sumy border region, where Russians have started to accumulate equipment and are amassing forces. Again, they're going to try and widen the territory, widen the front lines, so that the Ukrainians have to spread their troops even thinner. Now, as far as Volchansk itself, Ukrainian forces control about 60% of the town. The other 40% is under Russian control, obviously, or in a gray zone. 6 Russian border guards blew up in the Belgorod region as a result of a mine explosion. They were injured. It doesn't say that they were killed, but This situation is getting increasingly lethal, as always. Now here's Krinky. The Russians have claimed once again that they've driven the Ukrainians out of Krinky, and yet, number one, they're fighting over ruins at this point. But more to the point, the Ukrainians are still there. So every time the Russians say, oh yeah, we've got Krinky again, well, the Ukrainians show that they don't. And this is just the same kind of updates right there. That's the front lines, kind of a quick run through overview. No major changes, but the Russians still are kind of nibbling a little bit here and a little bit there, nibbling, trying to get a little bit farther each time. And Ukraine's going to need some help real fast. Let's go ahead and bust into the extras here. Meet Mrs. Valentina, who's 84 and a resident of Volchansk. At the age of 46, she was forced to flee her home because of the Chernobyl disaster. She moved to a village near Volchansk on the border with Russia. She had to flee her home again, this time because of Russian offensive and incessant shelling. I didn't think I would have to flee a second time, she says. This is harkening back to May of 2022. Negotiations between the Russians and the Ukrainians outside the Azovstal plant to talk about getting civilians and out of the plant and evacuated. Just a little reminder. It's tough enough. And that was a tough situation. And these two men managed to sit down and talk out a little bit. No peace agreements were reached, obviously. But every once in a while, you can find somebody on the other side that you can work with. And we'll end off with this chair, which if you look carefully, you'll see this cat has managed to claw her way through this fiber back and then use it as a bed that she is sleeping in, or he is sleeping in. And I thought that was just a fun way to end the video today. I don't have any other news for today. I do appreciate every single one of you, and I want you to know how much you mean to me. I wish I could give you all hearts and thumbs ups and all that kind of stuff, but just understand that I really am delighted every time I see each of your names. Luciano, Robbie, Paul, and excuse me, and Al. Sorry about that. Had a frog in my throat come all of my, just right then. I saw Sajaman. Glad to see you there, and always glad to see you as well. I just want you guys to know how much I appreciate you, and thank you for being here. So on that note, you have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you on the next video.